I step away from the details for a moment and I imagine myself 30 years in the future, sitting around a dining room table, surrounded by my friends. And the story of this decision comes up anecdotally. And it's a place of abundance, right? I'm not putting myself in a negative place to make them. I'm deliberately in a positive place. Long-term, things are going to work out. And now I'm thinking back to this decision that I made 30 years ago that has come up. Maybe it's helpful to someone. Maybe it's just relevant or funny in some way. And trying to just keep it as light as possible. And I tell the story of the decision that I made and why.
But this is my house, Mommy. So what I asked Mr. Springer for, it is, I know it is.
Welcome to The Pursuit of Home, coming to you from New York City. This is real people buying real estate and their unique journey to get there. We share the tips, tricks, and frameworks to help you navigate the bumps in the road that you won't see on reality TV or social media, and which no one has talked about until now. I'm Scott Harris, and I want to welcome you to The Pursuit of Home, my podcast. A lot of people ask me where the real estate market is going. There's a lot of money to be made when you get it right. On this week's episode, though, our buyer takes a shot at seeing into the future himself as he's trying to decide whether or not to buy a particular home. He uses an incredibly powerful framework that uses both his analytical mind and his imagination to make that decision. It's probably my most favorite episode so far, not in small part because I get to unpack the conversation with John Mark Shaw, who is my incredible business coach. We'll have John's info in the show notes if you want to get in touch with him, which I highly recommend. Creating a compelling, inspiring vision of the future is a lot of what I do with my clients and what I do with John. You want to know how that can help you find your home? Listen in to find out on this week's episode of The Pursuit of Home.
This beautiful set here at Studio 1873 is brought to you by the Everset. The Everset provides full-service staging and furniture rental solutions in the New York area. We work with Brown Harris Stevens and many other top real estate firms, staging their homes to sell quickly and at the highest price possible. Our staging is affordable without sacrificing quality or design. For more information, please visit us at staging.theeverset.com or email us at staging@theeverset.com to request a free proposal.
Avi, welcome to the show. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here with you, Scott.
I want to talk about your journey from the uncertainty of buying to the certainty of the decision to buy, because you use this framework that I was mentioning to get there. I don't want to jump the gun. So let's kind of start at the beginning. When we first were speaking, you mentioned that you couldn't see your life 5 years out, like 5 years into the future. So you weren't comfortable buying yet. So there was some uncertainty in that part. What shifted for you? Was it the kids, a job? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, let me unpack what I meant by the 5 years out thing. So start with, and yes, it was kids and job. Okay. But to kind of really unpack the context there, the situation that I was looking to avoid as a first-time buyer, but not as a first-time deal maker, was I didn't want to enter into a deal where I was suddenly going to, within a short time period, feel pressured to exit, right? And so I grew up in a home where my parents still own that home. I've heard stories. I know a lot of people who moved from home to home to home to home, and it worked great, or other times it did not work out well. And I felt that while there are a myriad of things that we can't protect ourselves from a risk perspective, there's something that could happen tomorrow that would force me to sell this place. Okay. That's out of my control. There's nothing I can do about that. But there were just a few things that I could get to clarity on in a short enough time period where I could say, okay, now that I'm clear on, I know how many kids I'm having. From a professional standpoint, my wife is a doctor. She was in a hospital here in Manhattan. Was she going to stay? Was she going to go? Was staying in Manhattan important to us? These were the things that we wanted to get a little more clarity on. And we felt that we could be patient enough, just short enough time. When we first talked about it, I wasn't yet ready to buy, right? And I wanted to get clarity on those things. And then once we had it, then we could act decisively.
Right. So it was like you were willing to sit in the uncertainty of where are we going to live until you had some certainty elsewhere, which I think that pressure, if you're out there like, God, the pressure of like wanting this home, you really want it so badly that you almost jump the gun So, Avi, listening to you talk about it, I think there's a certain amount of like willingness to sit in the unknown, which I want to give you a lot of credit for. So once you're going to buy, you're like, all right, we're going to buy. The next logical question is where, and you were debating the city or the suburbs. It's a common decision that people need to make. You said you weren't sure if you were a city guy or a suburbs guy. How did you come to that decision? I mean, it sounds like your wife's job was in the city. Was that it, or was there more to it?
So I grew up in the suburbs, loved the suburbs, lived in Manhattan, loved Manhattan. For us, we had a preference or bias toward Manhattan, but it was such a hypothetical conversation when you're talking about where do you want to live. And so one of the things and reasons I reached out to you was, well, instead of this being a hypothetical question, how about make this practical? Well, of the available options, now that we're ready to buy, is there one that we can see ourselves living in for a long time and raising our kids? And maybe we move to something else if an opportunity comes up, but this is where we feel we're comfortable being for a long time. Is that going to be possible for us? Or is that not at this time that we're ready to buy from a financial perspective? And therefore we should look elsewhere.
Right. So it's this willingness to kind of like, let me get educated both from a emotional perspective, like, does this feel like home to us, but also from the dollars and cents perspective, which I think very few people, if you're listening, it's like so many people put the dollars and cents right out in front, and it like, you sort of forget how important the other part, like, okay, great, we can afford to live somewhere, but do we want to live there in the first place? So like getting a sense of like, what does that home look like? I think you did a really good job in leaving that out front. But I do want to talk about the money conversation, because I think ultimately, the phrase you used, which I thought was it sort of clicked for me, was that you said you hadn't done the work because maybe you were afraid of the answer. And, if you're out there thinking about buying, there are a couple of things in this conversation I know are going to be really important to hear, but this is something you really need to hear. Can you talk about what it means to be afraid of the answer? Because there's just something emotional in there. And I know that buyers everywhere go through this.
Yeah, sure. The work that I had done was that I understood that there were condo boards and there were co-op boards and there were different requirements, standards. And what started to look to me like the properties that we were going to look at might not just be the standard average top of the bell curve, path. And so what I wanted to connect with you on was, well, again, if we come back to specific properties that we can look at, right? Which of those, what are their requirements going to be? Which of the accounts that I have are going to be relevant to the package if a package is needed? What's not going to be relevant? How does this play out as someone who had not done it before and who reads, there's all kinds of content out there. Excited for you to have this podcast to get past some of that stuff.
Right.
But there's so much to go through. And so connecting with you to really go through the work at the particular level of, okay, these are my options. This is what I can bring to the table. And then the fear part was, well, there was this hypothetical question of, well, would I prefer Manhattan or would I prefer the suburbs? And the fear was, well, am I going to be the one to make that decision for myself of, oh, this is what it would look like here. This is what it would look like there. I choose this. Or was I going to be priced out because my requirements of what I'm looking to live in Manhattan is not going to make sense. And therefore I'm going to get a lot more space, in the suburbs, and I'm going to be happy with that.
Right. So if you're out there and you're like, you're living in a place where there aren't condominiums or cooperative apartments, this applies to you, because this is the same kind of conversation that you're going to sit down with a real estate agent and talk about getting approved for a mortgage. Here's the information. Maybe you don't love the answer. Maybe you're willing to make some sacrifices to live in the place you want to live in, but it's also, it's so important to get the information. If you're going to a doctor, people sometimes don't go to the doctor because they don't want to have the answer. But once you have the answer, then you can do something with it. And I think that's that fear part and that unknown, and you got over that. So, Right. I mean, once you had the information to know, like, hey, can we buy in the city? Can we buy in the suburbs? Or maybe there's only one answer. Well, maybe the answer is we can afford a certain level that's less, and we're going to make some choices based on that. But at least you had the answer. Now we get to the real heart of what made your journey so special, at least as far as I could tell. You were debating a particular property to buy, and it had some specific risks. Again, we were talking about the uncertainty and what risks you felt like you were willing to take. But this is a builder who's willing to deliver a finished apartment for you, which you'd sign a contract. It would happen a few months later. That can be so scary for people, but it didn't seem like that was the part that scared you. It was just that you needed to decide if this was the right home. So can you walk us through the framework that you used to get to your decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there were a bunch of risks that were making me uncomfortable. I was concerned about, and I found myself thinking through all the permutations and the ins and outs of them. And a framework that I like to apply for making a big decision is that I step away from the details for a moment and I imagine myself 30 years in the future, sitting around a dining room table, surrounded by my friends, and the story of this decision comes up anecdotally. And it's a place of abundance, right? I'm not putting myself in a negative place to make them. I'm deliberately in a positive place. Long-term, things are going to work out. And now I'm thinking back to this decision that I made 30 years ago that has come up. Maybe it's helpful to someone. Maybe it's just relevant or funny in some way. And trying to just keep it as light as possible. And I tell the story of the decision that I made and why. And the act of doing that, for me, I just wind up feeling like one of those answers is right. Every time I've done that exercise, I find just the telling of it, it feels wrong when I'm telling it a certain way, and then it feels right when I tell it the other way. And I actually, the first few times I would do it, I would actually do it out loud. There are times where I'll sit with my wife, we'll sit around the table and I'll tell the story. I've done it now a lot of times, so I can do it just in my own mind. And I just find it very helpful to step away from the details. And in hindsight, it feels so much clearer. And so given the risks involved with this particular situation, the seller was saying that the work would be done in 6 months. Everyone I talked to said, whatever the time is, double that. Probably not going to happen, on the time. It did wind up taking twice the amount of time. There did wind up being all kinds of ups and downs, but ultimately I did wind up in the place, that I had, was afraid I might not be able to get into with the deal, that I was really happy with, and all the risks did wind up working out. And I felt comfortable making those decisions because of the time that I'd taken in that ambiguity, and then ultimately the exercise of this is a risk that I'm comfortable taking.
So brilliant. So, I mean, to just reframe it, you were like, you're this old guy, you're telling the story, you got kids, and maybe they even have grandkids, and you're like, oh, I remember back when, and like you told the story, like, well, we had this thing and we walked away from it. And then you're like, in that case, it just didn't give you the excitement and energy. You're like, or we leaned in and made this decision and it made you really happy. And you're like, you didn't have to, it was a neck down almost decision, like all the thinking, all the smarts and all the stuff that got you to have a few dollars in the bank to save money to buy the place. It's not that goes out the window, but it's the wrong time to use all of that information. And that's really like where your heart is, right?
Yes. And I think, yes, there was the telling of it does tap into kind of the neck down, but the telling of the story and the thinking through how I'm going to tell the story is a bit cerebral, right? Of which versions of this am I going to tell, right? And for me, on this particular deal, there were the risks, and for the framing for me was, well, could I identify the risks and sufficiently mitigate them in a way that I was comfortable with? And so when I tell the story of, well, there were risks, but I knew what they were. These are the steps that I took to mitigate those risks. The other risks, the unknown unknowns, there's just nothing you could do about that. And I made the decision. I felt good about it. And when I told the version of, well, I couldn't identify what all the risks were, or there weren't enough paths to mitigate that risk, and therefore I walked away. And while I'm curious, I feel good about having walked away. Right? That would have been different. But because I could get to that kind of cerebral clarity around what were the risks that I was mitigating, how was I going to de-risk them, that wound up getting me to the place of, yeah, I feel comfortable taking this risk.
Right. And if you're listening, I mean, thank you for the clarity, because I do think that that's, for some people, are definitely more thinkers, and you've given them really a good way to go around this. But also, if you're just buying a house, quote unquote, just buying, and it's not a big construction project that you're getting into, maybe this exercise gets even easier then, and maybe, God willing, there are fewer risks. Avi, thank you so much for sharing this with us. We're going to unpack it a little bit more for the rest of the episode, but really love being with you here, and look forward to hanging out with you soon.
Thanks, Scott. Look forward to seeing you soon.
What I loved about that conversation with Avi was how lucid it was. And I think if you're out there and you're more of an analytical person, I know I'm not an analytical person by nature, but if you are, it's all of the frameworks and the way that Avi was going about his home purchase was so inspiring to me. And I want to talk more about it. So after the break, we're going to speak with John Mark Shaw, executive and life coach. He's a business development consultant. He's a professional speaker and a successful entrepreneur with over 25 years of executive leadership, to unpack my conversation with Avi. So we'll be right back.
This beautiful set here at Studio 1873 is brought to you by the Everset. The Everset provides full-service staging and furniture rental solutions in the New York area. We work with Brown Harris Stevens and many other top real estate firms, staging their homes to sell quickly and at the highest price possible. Our staging is affordable without sacrificing quality or design. For more information, please visit us at staging.theeverset.com or email us at staging@theeverset.com to request a free proposal.
Welcome back. I'd like to welcome John Mark Shaw to the podcast. Hi, John.
Hi, Scott. I'm so thrilled and grateful to be here with you today. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm going to do a little introduction for you, John. Prior to launching your coaching and consulting practice, John served as the co-founder and chief operating officer of Hill Country, one of my favorite barbecue restaurants in New York City, where he built a $30 million company from the ground up and led a team of 400, lots of restaurant experience, which we may dive in. I don't know. Maybe John will want to talk more about that. But not only is John an amazing business coach, he's also my business coach. So I've seen close up how he's helped me and other friends expand their businesses. I've had John join me for webinars and had the chance to speak to him in his audiences as well. He's helped me tremendously. So that's why I wanted to bring you here, John, because I know your focus on changing the frameworks that people use, not to look just at their business, but their lives, I think would be really helpful for everybody listening. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
It's right at the top of your website, your mission to empower people to connect to their higher power and purpose, to follow their inner guidance, and to create businesses and lives that they love. You're normally working with entrepreneurs, but I want to talk about Avi as a buyer and how, what were your initial thoughts of that conversation before we, let's set the table.
First of all, I loved that he really is operating at a higher level of awareness and has a very enlightened approach to decision making. And so I really enjoyed that he had what I would call an enlightened or a visionary mindset. And he's using what I would call three of our higher mental faculties in his decision-making process. He's using the power of his reason, right? He's also using the power of imagination and the power of intuition. And I think we'll break down more of his framework. But I think the idea is that highly successful people make decisions, are decisive, and make decisions quickly and rarely, if ever, change their mind. That's a great quote from Think and Grow Rich. But also, they give themselves the gift of having the patience to gather enough information with their reason so that they can make powerful, intuitively backed, empowered decisions. So it's a balance. If you could think of it as a balance of left brain and right brain, or a balance of reason and imagination and intuition. And I think that's the as an overall framework, giving yourself the gift of the patience to gather information until you have that certainty. And, that book by Malcolm Gladwell talks about blink. You need enough information from your left brain to be able to develop a level of certainty that you can then make an empowered decision, because you cannot solve for all of the variables. It has to just be a sufficiency of information for you to have the confidence to make an empowered decision.
Yeah. Avi really, it was impressive the way he was talking about risk and downside and uncertainty.
Yes.
He seemed to have handled it well, when I think a lot of people kind of throw their things get kind of overwhelming, and it's like the hardest thing to deal with, that uncertainty. So how do you help people manage their own uncertainty?
So one of the things that Avi was doing was he was really utilizing a very classic Stoic philosophy principle. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, or Ryan Holiday is a great modern writer who's making them famous again. But one of the most important things about managing risk and decision making is this. What Epictetus wrote was that the secret to happiness is to know the difference between what you can control and what you can't control. And essentially to control what you can and accept what you can't control. Actually, this is the basis, the underpinning of a very famous quote in Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Which is the serenity prayer. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So solving for that is very important. Yes.
And speaking of knowledge, right? I think he was very humble in the sense that he talked about doing the work instead of, and sort of in the face of, or finally doing the work, so that he got over what he called, like, I didn't want to be afraid of the answer. I mean, there's that paradox there, right? People are afraid of uncertainty, but then they may not want the information either. How do you get people over that hump? Because it is kind of a push-pull. You're like, I really need to know what I need to know. Like you said, it's like I need to know the sufficient amount of information to make a decision, but gosh, what if the information is not what I want? So what's the work there?
So I loved his process, which is he had uncertainty and to focus on what he could control. How many kids are we going to have? And where are we going to be working? Where's my wife, who's a doctor, going to be working? Control that, solve for that, and then have the courage to lean into the imagination of where would we love to live now? Now that we know more, now we have the courage. Part of the work is to have the courage, and why you call your business Visionary Brokerage, right? Because it's the courage to really live into a dream, to describe that dream. And then we're back to the reason. Right. And then the work is the due diligence. So the work is the courage to be a visionary, but also the willingness to do the due diligence, right? To research the co-ops and condo boards and the mortgages and the financials and to solve for enough information and to have the courage to look at your finances, right? That can be painful for some people. A lot of people choose to avoid it and not look at it. But you need to really understand fully when you're making a purchase. That work is the willingness to take a look at it, an objective look at it. I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, it's like the resources are not just the money. I mean, it's good. Okay, I know how much money I have, but it's like all the information itself is the resource.
Exactly.
Where can I go to get it? Who knows that answer? Who's going to give me advice on how to get the answer? Like, who are your mentors? It's not just your real estate agent. It's all the different people in your life who've come before. There's just this wealth of information that people sometimes get a little afraid, like they don't want to appear like they don't know what they're doing, except everybody is in the dark. People only buy a house every 7 to 9 years. So of course it's always going to be a learning process. But the neatest thing I think Avi did was this, I think we called it like future casting.
Yes.
I think I've heard you call it a time machine, sort of assuming that it all worked out at the end. And again, Avi was this like super analytical guy, but it seems like it could be a challenge for someone who is realistic, but Avi figured it out. So I guess what I'm hoping you can do, because you're a teacher and you're a coach, you're talking to people all the time struggling to try to open up to this. How would you explain it at its most basic level so that somebody can do this kind of future casting, time travel into the future themselves?
Well, look, I thought it was brilliant. And it's the idea of that you can connect using your mental faculty of imagination to think beyond your present circumstances and to imagine a future. All great creation is like that. I think one of the things that Avi understands, probably intuitively, is that there's something called a results formula. This is a way of thinking about it that's very practical and down to earth. And it goes like this. Our thoughts generate feelings. If you think an empowered thought, you feel more empowered and encouraged. You think a discouraging thought, something about a loss, something you regret, a fear, then you feel fearful. And then our emotions, our feelings generate actions or inactions that are either empowering or disempowering. And then that generates our results. And so he talked about shifting to an abundance mindset. He used those words. That's an aspect of it. In a very basic way, our thinking will determine our feelings and our actions that will determine our results. So he knew enough, regardless of, there's a spiritual aspect, there's a quantum physics aspect. But the most important thing to know is that as you elevate your thinking, you think from possibility, that will change the nature of your actions and your results. And so he was able to imagine a future where he was telling the story, right, and feeling really empowered about it. And it was brilliant. It's connecting to what you call your future self. How am I going to feel when I tell this story in 30 years, right? And so the idea that we have the ability to generate an energetic state that is a match to the reality we want, that is a match to the future, right? And so he was able to design something in his mind, an experience, and step into it. One of the great examples of this right now is Novak Djokovic, the best tennis player in the world. And he said, every single day since I was 7 years old, I've imagined being the best tennis player in the world and holding the Wimbledon trophy. And I did that every single day. And I do that every day. And I didn't only see it, but I felt it in every bone in my body, right? And as you think that way, right, you start to feel encouraged. And then what happens is you act more boldly. You think more bravely, you act more boldly. And so because he allowed himself to think more bravely, he was able to have the courage and the belief in himself to make an empowered decision. Because at the end of the day, as he said, there's always risk. You can't control all the risk, but you are able to step into your future self enough using your imagination to get some guidance from that future self, right? And that's a visionary move. And so despite how practically minded, I would say Avi is very balanced, right? He has a very balanced ability to use his rational mind, but also his intuitive, imaginative mind. And I'm sure he's very successful outside of this transaction as a result.
Well, John, I have to say, you've helped me unpack the conversation, like in the true sense of the word. So thank you for your brilliant insight. And we're going to put all your contact information in the show notes. And I look forward to having you back for future conversations about all of the things that my buyers are going through. So thanks again.
Thanks so much. This has been so much fun and a great joy. Thank you, Scotty.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm inspired. I want to thank our buyer for being so open about his own journey. Thinking about the older version of yourself, telling the story of your life is so simple. Why doesn't everyone do that when they're making a tough decision? Is it just too scary to trust that your gut is going to tell you the right answer? I also want to thank John Mark Shaw for sharing his insights with us as well. I hope this was as helpful to you as it was for me. If you like the podcast, we're part of the More Network, powered by Brown Harris Stevens. I'd love for you to check out all the amazing podcasts on the network talking about the New York City real estate market and beyond. And if you found this episode helpful, rate and review it wherever you're listening to your podcast. Push that follow button on YouTube, share it with your friends, and check out the show notes if you would like to apply to be on the show and talk about your buying experience. I'll see you next time. Real estate touches every aspect of our lives, from design and architecture to investing and the economy. Now there's a way to get all your real estate information in one place, the More Network. With more than 20 webcast series and podcasts, the Mastery of Real Estate Network is powered by Brown Harris Stevens, one of the country's most distinguished brokerages. Discover advice from notable entrepreneurs, compelling topics, and access top global real estate experts. Learn more about and subscribe to our YouTube and Apple podcasts by visiting getmorenetwork.com.